Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders, Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Some Dude 267, Longsight, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, and Arthur Roy. You are the reason why this content remains homicidal. No, not really. We don't do that here. But we do talk about it sometimes, and today we are going to discuss some locomotives that, on the surface, don't look very intimidating. Some of them look downright adorable. Yet in reality, they are out for blood. This is 5 trains that were perfectly designed to murder their occupants. Fowlers Ghost. Now, I want to warn you guys up front, a few of the choices I made have actually appeared on some of my worst trains ever lists because, let's be fair, if a locomotive is out to kill the people operating it, that means it's probably really bad. Now, not all of them have been talked about before, but a couple of them have, and this is one of them. But for those of you who may have missed that episode, or are new to the channel, hello by the way, Fowlers Ghost was an experimental fireless 240 steam locomotive, and it was designed by John Fowler, constructed in 1861. John Fowler, by the way, was an English civil engineer, and he specialized in the construction of railways and railway infrastructure. Fowlers Ghost actually wasn't the official name of the locomotive, but the name was given to it by the Railway magazine in a retrospective article that was published in January of 1901, because Fowler was a respected engineer and the locomotive was a deeply embarrassing subject for him. So much so that after it was scrapped, he denied it ever existed. Now you may be wondering, how is a steam locomotive fireless? After all, that's kind of an integral part of any steam locomotive, and that's very true. Well, the solution to this was twofold. For one thing, the locomotive was designed to actually recycle excess steam. Through complicated but admittedly somewhat innovative mechanics, the locomotive was capable of recondensing steam that it had already used and feed it back into its own boiler. And it actually wasn't fireless all the time. It operated conventionally in the open, but the idea of the locomotive was to operate in tunnel systems. A big problem in those days was the utilization of steam locomotives in tunnels. As you can imagine, the smoke from a steam locomotive going through a tunnel can be pretty overwhelming for a crew, and there's a reason we generally use electric locomotives in subways, for example. However, there was another issue that plagued Fowler's Ghost, and that's where we get into the lethality of it. You see, the Ghost used fire bricks for the heat when it wasn't using an open flame. Its completely normal firebox was connected to a combustion chamber that contained fire bricks, which are blocks of ceramic material that absorb and retain a tremendous amount of heat if they're left near a source of it. The thought was that when the fire had to be damped out so the engine didn't release smoke in the tunnels, the fire bricks would retain enough heat to keep the engine going until it got out of the tunnels. But on its first trial run, the boiler feed pumps, namely the things that put water in it, jammed. The crew had no way of putting more water into the locomotive, and unlike a traditional steam locomotive, which can simply drop out the fire onto the rails to cool the boiler down, Fowler's Ghost had no way of getting rid of those fire bricks. They were too hot to remove by hand, and they couldn't drop them out of the engine. It came very close to detonating, but thankfully this never occurred. Even without this major fault, its second trial didn't go well either, because it just didn't steam well. The mechanics were interesting, but the engine just wasn't as efficient as Fowler thought it would be, and it was considered a complete failure. Fowler went on to make some excellent tank engines in 1864, known as the A-Class, and with updates, the B-Class, so he was definitely able to maintain his reputation after this mistake. The London, Midland and Scottish Railway, number 6399, Fury. I still love that name, because this is yet another locomotive that also appeared on my list of bad trains, and if you watch that part you know exactly why, because I did definitely talk about this problem when I mentioned why it was so bad. The Fury was designed to be a high-pressure steam locomotive. The actual difference between high-pressure steam and low-pressure steam can actually vary a little bit depending on the era you're talking about, or the mechanics involved, but generally speaking, a typical steam locomotive of this era would be operating between 200 to 250 psi. high-pressure steam is considered to start at around 350 psi. And that's great and all, except for the fact that the Fury, in its original form, could operate at up to 1,800 psi. So, okay, that's a very high pressure, and the whole point of it was to seek out possible new designs for the future of steam locomotive, something that could push steam forward into the modern age, and the Fury absolutely did not do that. Its inner workings just couldn't handle the extreme pressure it was working at, making things incredibly dangerous, and this is the first one on the list that actually does have a technical body count. On the 10th of February 1930, the locomotive was approaching Carstairs Station at low speed. While it was doing this, one of the ultra-high-pressure tubes inside of it burst, and the escaping steam ejected the coal fire through the door to the firebox, and killed one Mr. Lewis Schofield of the Superheater Company. The post-investigation of the accident couldn't actually figure out why the tube had burst, and after repair, it did actually carry out some more trials until early 1934, but ultimately they couldn't make it work well and in a safe way. So it was eventually scrapped, but that actually happened way later. And this was a little bit of a flub of mine when I first talked about it. It was scrapped eventually, but not before being converted into a Royal Scot Class number 6170 British Legion. Apparently this locomotive just loved awesome names. And it actually served in that form until 1962, and then it was scrapped. The British Rail Class 220 2005 refit. No, get out of here! It's not time for you yet. I know I said your name, but this was after you went defunct. You don't belong here. Get out! Out! Out with you! Begone, scourge of trains everywhere. The British Rail Class 220, also known as a Voyager, is a diesel-electric high-speed multiple-unit passenger train. It was actually constructed in Belgium by Bombardier. Bombardier? Apparently I'm supposed to say it the French way. I always say Bombardier because that's the way we say it in English. But I guess you're supposed to say it like Bombardier or something. I don't know. I'm trying my best. They were introduced in 2001, and they were meant to replace the InterCity 125s. They were originally operated by Virgin CrossCountry, and since 2007 have just been operated by simply CrossCountry. They're actually still in service now, and to be honest, most of the time they're actually alright. They're not so amazing that I put them on best trains ever lists, but they're not really awful, so I wouldn't say they were bad, except for one situation. See, between 2005 and 2006, the locomotives went through a refit. This is not unusual. Parts wear in trains all the time. You need to go in, refit them, refurbish them, whatever you have to do. There's nothing unusual about that in particular. What was unusual was that the refit didn't actually go well. It was done completely wrong. The result of this mistake was that the 220s began to suffer exhaust fires. Just all the time. Fortunately, due to modern safety standards, it doesn't seem like this ever managed to kill anybody, but it could have, and the mistakes in the refit were resolved pretty quickly. So nowadays, no, they probably will not spontaneously combust, but there was a brief time in 2006 where there was the potential for that. The British Rail Class 21. Okay, now you can come in. Come on, show your face. There you go, everybody say hi! Everyone's favorite person! Okay, get out! Ugh. Class 21 is another repeat, I know. It was, in fact, a British rail locomotive constructed by the North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow between 1958 and 1960. They produced 58 of them, and yes, they were diesel electrics introduced for the modernization plan. There's a reason they appeared on worst trains ever, because they were hideously unreliable and didn't last past 1971. But there was one key, major, alarming thing about them that probably needed to be spelled out a bit more clearly, as I only mentioned it once when I first talked about it, because I cannot believe that nobody died as a result of these things. The major issue with the 21, beyond the unreliability, was the engine room fires. The engines just caught alight and burned with the heat of 1,000 suns. The fires were bad enough that several of the locomotives were completely written off, being deemed too damaged to repair. Of the ones that didn't catch fire, all but 20 of them wound up being scrapped. Those 20 would go through a rebuild and become Class 29, but due to their non-standard nature, they didn't last particularly long either, although they were a lot better and didn't catch fire and try to kill you. So that was nice. Early Doodlebugs. I get to talk about Doodlebugs! I'm so excited! I love Doodlebugs! Look at it. Look at it. It's so cute. Doodlebug, or sometimes Hoodlebugs, is actually just a nickname in the United States for a self-propelled railcar. Why do we call them Doodlebugs, you may ask? I will answer this question. There's actually two reasons for it. The first one is that, well, have you ever seen these? You may not call them Doodlebugs where you live. You may call them roly-polies or hillbugs, or maybe their actual name, which is armadillididae. Okay, I see why no one calls them that. That makes sense. But people thought that the rail cars actually kind of looked like them. And I guess at a glance they looked kind of insect-like. On top of that, they had a tendency to wobble gently as they went down the track, or doodle along the track. So Doodlebug was a name that stuck. My worldwide audience may be getting confused, as in some places you call this a doodlebug, or this a doodlebug, or even this a doodlebug. It's a very overused name now that I really think about it. But the point is, doodlebugs were actually a fairly revolutionary idea on the rail lines. First of all, they weren't steam or electric. The early ones were driven by gasoline. Later they would become diesel, and this is a relevant topic that I will bring up later. And even though they were smaller than a full-size train, this was somewhat beneficial, as on smaller regional branch lines, you didn't need a full-size train with a steam locomotive. You could just throw a doodlebug on the line, and they could transport a small number of passengers where they needed to go, and make a profit while doing that. They were exceptional, and a ton of railways wound up using them. However, the early ones had a fairly major flaw, and it was because they were designed to run on gasoline, particularly the ones that were employed by the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, there were several problems with utilizing gasoline in this manner. For one thing, gasoline has a much lower flash point than diesel fuel. It will much more readily burst into flame well before thick diesel fuel will. That in itself isn't a horrifying prospect. After all, plenty of cars on the roads use gasoline. But what was a bit more alarming was that the design of these doodlebugs, which were PRR class GEW 275, caused the exhaust of the engine to leak into the driver's cab. You may recognize this as being alarmingly dangerous, as it can very easily lead to what we know as carbon monoxide poisoning. And even in 1940, they knew the dangers of carbon monoxide. And even though drivers complained about this, the railroad didn't seem too concerned about the problem. This little teeny tiny itsy bitsy problem that could easily incapacitate and or kill their drivers was not actually addressed until July 31st, 1940, when what is known as the Doodlebug disaster happened in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. The Doodlebug involved, number 4648, was supposed to pull off to a siding and let a big heavy freight train pass. But because the driver was suffering the early effects of carbon monoxide poisoning, he completely missed and bypassed the siding, causing a head-on collision that killed 43 people, all of whom were on board the Doodlebug. It was only after the investigation revealed that he had been incapacitated by the carbon monoxide that the Pennsy realized, oh, right, maybe having our drivers inhaling poisonous fumes might not be the best call. So the issue was addressed, and the vast majority of Doodlebugs after this point ran on diesel fuel, which not only was less likely to burst into flame, like Doodlebug 4648 did, but were designed to send their noxious fumes outside, away from people's lungs, so you don't get any more people killed. I don't know why it took 43 deaths for you to figure that out. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.